These are the top things I think about when trying to decide if someone should avoid fasting. The most basic reason to avoid fasting is if you simply don't want to do it. No one should ever feel any stress about it. Fasting should be anti-stressful, honestly. It's an opportunity to let the system rest and reset. The thought process should always be positive and encouraging. And if you're not feeling this way, just take a pass on it. Maybe try again a different day, or don't. There's no pressure. The second reason to avoid it is if you're struggling with an eating disorder. For some people, fasting can trigger binge eating, and certainly that could be counterproductive. Other people might be dealing with anorexia, bulimia, or other conditions where fasting could worsen mental health or be directly harmful. People with anorexia, don't need anyone to tell them that fasting can help you lose weight, all right? It's obvious to them. But here's a scenario where it's so inappropriately applied. Stay far away from situations like that. I have a lot more to say about eating disorders in an article which I'll link below. Even apart from an eating disorder, no one should be fasting who's underweight or malnourished. They should be eating more, most likely. So there are certain times when someone who's not overweight might consider fasting, exploring possible longevity benefits, helping with digestive issues, but I use a BMI of 20 as a pretty hard cutoff, and it gets increasingly questionable the closer you get to that. Type 1 diabetes, a key contraindication. You can run into serious issues with ketoacidosis if you tried fasting in that scenario, so that's a no-go in my mind. Pregnancy, hopefully another obvious never fasting scenario, so we're going in the opposite direction there. After the pregnancy is over, if you're breastfeeding, there's a relative contraindication, at least in the short term. If you are breastfeeding for an extended period of time and everything is stable with the supply and you're working on trying to re-equilibrate your weight, you can consider a mild fasting practice at some point, transitioning after some number of months, but you have to listen to your body and communicate with your healthcare team about it. Next up, children and adolescents. So for my purposes here, I consider under 18 to be a relative contraindication to fasting. We definitely have a lot of problems with obesity in childhood, and I have seen many children from religious families who practice fasting and are developing healthy and normally. And so I think there is a space to consider whether this type of practice could help some young people who are struggling with obesity. But just to be clear, that is not what I'm doing here. Next, I want to highlight a couple medication-specific issues. So, insulin. Fasting can be a more powerful intervention for type 2 diabetes than insulin. So, it is possible to replace insulin with fasting under certain circumstances. And that means that if you are taking insulin and you start fasting, you can absolutely drop your blood sugar to dangerous levels. No one should ever attempt such a thing without oversight from the person who is prescribing you insulin. Every medical provider who prescribes insulin will have a process for handling insulin when their patients are fasting for a medical procedure like a colonoscopy. So you need to coordinate that with them. Ideally, anyone doing such a thing would have a continuous glucose monitor, or at the very least have frequent monitoring of their blood sugar. Next medication issue is basically any other medicine for type 2 diabetes. All right, so fasting is such a powerful root level intervention for type 2 diabetes that you add it to any medication and you can drive the blood sugar too low. So glipizide, Jardiance, even metformin, even a GLP-1. So people say, oh, metformin can't drive your blood sugar too low. Well, look, if you are fasting, then it could. So be thoughtful, ease into it, be ready to scale back, communicate with your medical team about it. I say reducing medication use from type 2 diabetes is probably the best use of fasting I've found. But it must be approached thoughtfully and carefully, and you've got to have open communication with your medical team. Similarly, I say blood pressure medications. So any blood pressure lowering medicine can cause you to feel dizzy or lightheaded, and fasting, especially for some people, can lower blood pressure. So if you're taking blood pressure lowering medicines and you start fasting, then you could you could have your blood pressure drop too low, you could feel dizzy, lightheaded. And then if you're taking both blood pressure and blood sugar lowering medicines, then you've got, double potential. So you have to be very thoughtful. Another medication issue, warfarin. So if you are someone who takes warfarin, you know how changing your diet can affect your INR. So you start fasting. Obviously, it's a change. It can have an impact. So it's not that you can't do it. It's just that you have to be mindful that you might need more frequent monitoring and dose adjustment. So like everything with warfarin, right? Getting into a routine is very helpful. Another medication issue, NSAIDs. So all anti-inflammatory non-steroidal medicines like the ibuprofens, naproxen, they need to be taken with food. So you start fasting, all right? You don't want to be putting NSAIDs into an empty stomach. You risk getting an ulcer or even GI bleeding, that'd be not good. So if you have to take one, consider discussing with your provider about switching to a once daily version, something like meloxicam, and also consider that many people find the fasting state to be a naturally anti-inflammatory state, and maybe you don't need the NSAID while you're fasting. It's something to explore. Talk with your medical team about it. Different psychiatric and anti-seizure medicines can have requirements to be taken with food, and that can be due to how they're absorbed. So this is not an issue with SSRIs, but if you are taking any other medication like that, you should review it with your prescriber just to make sure that it's okay. Another issue, thyroid replacement. So if you take levothyroxine, you should already be taking that on an empty stomach. So fasting is not an issue with that. But if you are losing weight and if you're fasting, this can definitely affect your metabolism. And so you might have different requirements for thyroid replacement if you're doing such a thing. So probably have to keep an eye on your symptoms, keep an eye on the TSH. So I hope you are getting the general idea from me with my perspective on this. This is not a comprehensive list. Really, I say, if you have any medical condition or you take any medication, talk with your healthcare provider about it. Talk about what you're doing with your dietary routine or a fasting practice. This is why we have people like this. They're there to help you. And as a PCP myself, I know if my name is on the line of a script, I would want to know what my patient is doing so we can have a thoughtful discussion about it. So I hope that these thoughts are helpful. Feel free to share any thoughts and comments you have about it, and I hope you're well.